I would begin by thanking Comrades of In Defense of Reason and Lamakaan. This is the second time I've come here. Last time it was 2018 when there was a 3-day workshop on caste question. Is it too loud? It's okay. So, without further ado, I would like to begin the discussion on the topic because it's better if we have more time for question, answer, and discussion rather than one sided talk or lecture delivered by myself. The topic is Marxism and the question of identity. And as we know, this is a ticklish subject for Marxist Leninist movement all over the world. It has been hotly debated for more than 4 decades. It pertains basically to the question whether Marxism is sufficient to understand the question of identity and the various forms of social oppression based on different identities. That is the principal question around which the whole debate has developed during last 45 years. We have been, listening to the claims of various identity politics theorists that Marxism is not sufficient to understand the question of various identities, for instance, caste or gender or sexual orientation, and different forms of social oppression based on these different identities. Their argument is Marxism is basically totalitarian. It has a totalizing emphasis on class, and therefore it is class reductionist, economic determinist. Some are ready to concede that Marxism is effective in understanding economic exploitation and class exploitation, but it is not sufficient to understand the question of identities. So some of the people outrightly, reject Marxism. Some are ready to concede some ground to Marxism as far as class question or question of economic exploitation is concerned. But that difference doesn't mean much because the whole thing can be boiled down to their claim that Marxism is not enough to understand various forms of social oppression and the question of identity. Now, we need to go a little bit into the historical context in which this claim emerged, and the question of identities became one of the central questions of various social movements, various popular movements, revolutionary movement, protests, and resistance. 1960s, 1970s was the beginning of the period of defeat and reversal for the working class movement world around. In 1956, capitalism was restored in the Soviet Union with the 20th Congress, with the famous secret speech. First it was secret, later it was made public, speech of Khrushchev, which was basically a set of mudslinging on Stalin. And by 1956-57, there were various, you can say, crimes of the revisionist and social imperialist regime of USSR. For example, in Hungary, Soviet intervention in Hungary, Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia. And this was the period in which there was a radical movement against Vietnam War, which was developing especially in northwestern Europe and most specifically in France. In May 1968 movement in France, various kinds of ideological trends emerged. It was definitely a protest movement, a radical protest movement, but it was a very confused movement. Various ideological tendencies emerged from the May 1968 Paris. And one of those tendencies was that of postmodernism. The roots or seeds of postmodernism can be seen in the movement of 1968, May 1968 Paris. And it was this period which was a period of defeat and reversal for the working class world around. Even though there was great proletarian cultural revolution in China from 1966 onwards, the theorists of postmodernism and the theorists of post-colonial theory and also some so-called Maoists interpreted great proletarian cultural revolution in China as a revolution against party. against the Leninist party. It was claimed by certain, early theorists like Ellen Badiou and some other so-called Maoists. There was UJCML, a group of Maoists from which Badiou's group split away, which was called UFCML. They were claiming that GPCR, Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, is basically a revolution against the party. Leninist party was fit for taking power, seizing power, but in the period of socialist transition, you need a mass party, not a Leninist vanguard party. And therefore, GPCR was kind of a reaction to the concept of Leninist party, the concept of vanguard party, and it was kind of a revolution against the party. So one trend was there of Maoists, these French Maoists. Another trend was of postmodernist, of course. And this was the period where all these new social movements were developing. I mean, there was the civil rights movement in the US, where the question of racial social oppression was there, and there was a strong movement against racism. Various figures emerged from Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. So one was that. One was anti-Vietnam War movement all around the world. And in this period, it coincided with the defeat of socialism in the biggest socialist country, USSR. And at the same time, there was a great debate, organized by Chinese Communist Party against the Soviet Revisionist Party. Many of the communist parties in Eastern Europe, they took the position of Soviet Party, the revisionist position, and they deviated from revolutionary Marxism. So overall, the global scenario was one of defeat, reversal. There was a pessimism, there was setback, and in this scenario, the crimes committed by the social imperialist regime of USSR in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and different parts of the world by imperialist intervention, it was taken by the radical revolutionary youth movement and intelligentsia as the crimes of socialism or Marxism. And from there, a slogan emerged that we need something more radical than Marxism. There is something wrong with Marxism itself, which has led to Soviet Union turning into a social imperialist country, a social fascist regime. There is something inherently wrong with the Marxist doctrine, the idea of totality, the idea of universality, the focus on the question of class exploitation. These things have made Marxism into a class reductionist and economic deterministic dogma. And now we need something more radical than Marxism. And it was in this entire historical context of emergence of new social movements and the theorization of the philosophical foundations of these new social movements by postmodernists like Michel Foucault and post-Marxists like in the 1980s, post-Marxists like Laclau and Mao, Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mao. So it was this historical context in which questions that we have discussed in the beginning, that is Marxism sufficient to explain the question of social oppression based on various identities, or is it too class reductionist and too economic determinist to explain these questions? So with this historical context, one can understand how the question of identities and identity-based social oppression came to fore. And one can understand that before 1960s, this question was nowhere in the general political and philosophical discourse. It can be exemplified with one fact. There was this famous Encyclopedia of Social Sciences published in 1968. In that encyclopedia, you find no entry of identity. There is no entry under the head of identity. There is one entry called psychosocial identity crisis, which refers to the crisis which adolescents and teenagers go through when they enter that cusp from teenage to youth. So you find an entry about the psychological crisis, identity crisis of the adolescents, but in itself there is no entry of identity. There is no discussion of identity in the encyclopedia, the most important encyclopedia written in the mid-1960s, published in 1968. So certainly the question of identity in the academia or the popular political movements, revolutionary radical movements, had not assumed that kind of importance or centrality that we can witness today. With the emergence of new social movements in 1960s and their theorization by theorists like Michel Foucault and Laclau and Mauss, this question became a polarizing question for everyone who was concerned with social change in any way. And 1970s, 1980s was the period when this notion was systematically established by the postmodernist and post-Marxist theorists that Marxism is indeed not sufficient for understanding the question of identity. Now, this common sense became hegemonic by the time of the 1990s. In India also, if you look at university academia, that was the period when subaltern studies emerged as one of the most important academic trend in Indian academia in general, in social sciences, which started as an attempt to write history in the vein of E.P. Thompson, a British historian. He initiated the movement called History from Below. He has this famous book called The Making of English Working Class, classic book. Ranajit Guha in India, around whom this school of subaltern studies gathered, he started from that style of history writing in early 1980s, 1980, 1981. But in 1986, in the sixth volume of Subaltern Studies, the introduction was written by post-colonial theorists like 𝐺 𝐃𝐢𝐬𝐬𝐦 and Edward Said, whose book Orientalism was one of the milestone in the development of post-colonial theory. And from there, Subaltern Studies degenerated into postmodernist, post-colonial history writing. And subaltern studies from mid-1980s onwards became the principal torchbearer of postmodernist thought in academia in India. That was the time, by the 1990s, it was firmly established as the hegemonic trend and tendency in departments of history, departments of political science, departments of anthropology and sociology. And that was the time when I entered the university in 1999. At that time, Marxism had already become a shameful word. To be a Marxist was like being a pariah in the academic community. And that was how this whole idea of postmodernism, the question of identity politics and identitarianism entered into Indian academia. So one coordinate was this, the historical development, one coordinate of this historical context in which postmodernism, identity politics emerged was this collapse of socialist experiments first in the USSR and then collapse of socialist experiment in China after the death of Mao. When the Gang of Four were, persecuted and Deng Xiaoping and Hua Guofeng took power. The second coordinate was that with the beginning of crisis in 1973, the global depression, neoliberal onslaught also started as a way to resolve the crisis of profitability. The neoliberal onslaught basically comprised of attack on the rights of labor, informalization, contractualization, casualization. Second, freeing or unleashing the free flow of capital across boundaries, national boundaries, which we call liberalization, globalization, and financial deregulation, a much more fashionable term. So financial deregulation of labor markets in order to resolve the crisis of profitability that the capitalist world was facing. So on the whole, this was also the time of emergence of Thatcherism. I mean, the most conservative edition of Toryism in Britain and Reaganomics in America. So this was the period of the neocon revival in the West, and with this, some of the iconic events of this period was the defeat of coal miners' strike in Britain in 1983-84, which began a long period of downslide of organized workers' movement in Britain. And this was accompanied by parallel and similar incidents in other countries of Northwestern Europe and North America. So the overall atmosphere, philosophically and politically speaking, was one of reversal, defeat and retreat of the working class movement. And in this period, all these you can say pernicious weeds grew within the academia and within the, movements, social movements, popular movements against oppression, against inequality. The next important question from where we should begin to understand these claims of identity politics theoreticians that Marxism is insufficient to understand the question of identity, it is class reductionist, it is economic determinist. In order to probe or verify the truthness or falseness of these claims, the best way is to begin from the beginning, because most of these terms are, taken for granted. Their meaning becomes axiomatic. So one has to start with the question, what is identity? In order to answer this question, whether Marxism is really insufficient to understand this question, we need to understand what is identity. Identity is basically a sense of belonging to a particular group based on difference constituted by physical attributes like race or sex, or socially constructed or ossified attributes like caste, religion, gender, or regional attributes, linguistic attributes. So identity is basically a sense of belonging to any particular group constituted by a difference based on physical attributes, socially constructed or ossified attributes, or regional, linguistic, ethnic attributes. That is the most, the simplest definition of identity. What is identity? So first we need to understand that is the first major point or entry point for any discussion on the question of identity and the social oppressions based on different identities. The second important point in the discussion is that these differences based on physical attributes or regional attributes or socially constructed or ossified attributes, they don't in and by themselves constitute a social antagonism. In other words, any identity is not always already a site of social oppression. In even simpler terms, for example, men do not oppress women because they are men, or whites do not oppress black because they are white. These identities in and by themselves, they don't constitute a site of oppression. That is the second important point. Those who believe that any identity is always already in and by itself a site of oppression are obliged to conclude that men oppress women, for example, because they are men. Then what is the solution? This was the idea which led one of the streams of feminist movement in Europe called 𝐓𝐚, SCUN, Society for Cutting Up Men. Believe it or not, this was truly a group. There was a group called 𝐓𝐚, and they argued that all the mankind, the humanity, especially the men, are tainted with, patriarchal values. It is already in their genetic code. They oppress women because they are men. So we'll create a sperm bank, kill all the men, and breed a new generation. If you will, a new, breeding center of men who will be untainted from patriarchy, who will be untainted from the values of gender oppression. So this kind of, obviously, this is a ridiculous idea. Men don't oppress women because they are men, or Savarnas don't oppress Dalits because they are Savarnas, or whites don't oppress blacks because they are whites. This is the second important point, without which one would reach not only very pessimistic conclusion, there will be no solution whatsoever, not only pessimistic, but also thoroughly ahistorical and unscientific. So this is the second important point. The third important point is that any identity becomes a site of oppression, social oppression, in the framework or moment of class. If you look at the beginning of patriarchy and oppression of women, it started with the origin of private property class and state. Because at that time, at that primitive stage of society and history, it became necessary with the emergence of private property to determine the lineage, the genetic lineage of any person, because without that, heredity and hereditary rights could not be determined. So without private property, the idea of a heterosexual patriarchal family could not have come into existence. This is something which Engels said, but it has been accepted by even feminists, bourgeois feminists, like Kate Millett, or Simone de Beauvoir, who was a socialist feminist, which is an oxymoron. There is no such thing as proletarian feminism or socialist feminism. Feminism by itself is a bourgeois ideology. So, but we cannot go into that discussion right now. But it was very clearly, one can see that oppression of women has a history. It has a point of beginning. And one has to trace how it came into existence. And without that, one cannot understand how not only women oppression, gender-based oppression, sexual oppression, is based on, it comes into existence in a framework of class dynamics. Without that, these oppressions cannot emerge spontaneously. The same goes for caste. Caste is a separate thing from Varna. Varna caste system emerged in the latter half of the early Vedic period, around 10th, 11th century BC. Varnas, the first reference of the word Varna comes in the 10th mandala of Purush Sukt of Rigved. And there you don't find any reference or mention of the basic registers of Varna caste system as we know it today. What are the basic registers or characteristic features of Varna caste system today, or as we know it historically? Is one, hereditary division of labor. The second is commensal prejudices and untouchability. And third is caste-based endogamy. These are the three basic coordinates of Varna caste system which constitute Varna caste system as we know it today. Now, in the first reference in Purush Sukt, you don't find Varna to be hereditary. You don't find any reference to hereditary division of labor. You don't find any reference to Varna endogamy, and you don't find any reference to commensal prejudices or untouchability. Those who are interested in the origin and evolution of caste system through ages can read many books. I personally prefer and recommend 𝐓𝐚𝐥𝐤 𝐃𝐢𝐬𝐬𝐦 work, who resides in this city and one of the most brilliant historians of ancient India. Her book Caste, Origin, Functions and Dimensions, and her book The Making of Brahminical Hegemony. The two cutting edge research on caste system, and now one can add 𝐕𝐵𝐴𝐸𝐺 Jha's work on the origin of untouchability. It's called Chandalas, The Origins of Untouchability. These three books, there are many other books, but these, if one doesn't have the time to delve or plunge into long-term historical study, one can refer only these three books, and you will find that Varna system also emerged at the point of its origin. As D.D. Kosami pointed out, Varna division in the latter Vedic period was the embryonic division of labor and class division of the early Vedic society. And hereditary labor division, commensal prejudices and untouchability, and caste endogamy, they developed during the periods of what we call the great Janpatas, the ancient 16 tribal republics of 5th, 6th century BC in India. And in a process, the Varna divisions, which at the point of their origin were the class divisions of Vedic society, became an identity. What made Varna caste an identity? It was the religious and ritualistic ossification of the class division and labor division of early Vedic period into a religious code. Once you ritualistically ossify a class division or a labor division of a particular historical period into religious laws or religious scriptures or code, then that there becomes a relationship of correspondence between that particular identity and class dynamism. Varna, which was the class division at the point of origin its history, it became a social identity because of that religious ritualistic ossification. So here also one can see that this particular identity and the social oppression based on this particular identity of Varna caste uh, emerged in the moment of class. It originated in the moment of class. It originated in the framework of class antagonism. Same goes for racism. I mean, racism is, many people don't realize it's quite modern phenomenon. It, its origin can be traced with the 16th, 17th century colonial voyages when the European colonialists used the ideology of superiority of the white race to justify the enslavement of black people in the continent of Africa. Even in the ancient Greek period, or in general in the classical antiquity, the Roman civilization, the Greek civilization, there was interaction and exchanges with Africa, but there was no racism at that time. Racism, in that sense of all identity-based social oppression, is quite new to the history of the world as compared to caste oppression or gender oppression or sexual oppression. It is quite new in terms of its comparison to other identities. But race also became this particular identity which was based on the difference constituted by a physical attribute, physical biological attribute. Race also became a site of social oppression in the moment of class. It has relations with the emergence of a world market, colonial voyages, that was the period of mercantilism, and it became more consolidated and ossified as bourgeoisie of Europe transitioned from the period of mercantilism to industrialism, and later finance capital. So in that sense, these are just a few examples to prove that any identity is not always already a site of oppression. It becomes a site of oppression in the moment and framework of class dynamics of a society. So that is the third important point. The fourth important point is that once an identity becomes a site of social oppression, then social oppression becomes relatively autonomous from relations of class. Social oppression, if you will, becomes relatively autonomous from class exploitation, and it reacts back on class exploitation. So there is no one-way traffic, there is a two-way traffic. Once a social oppression becomes institutionalized and consolidated in the pores of society, then it reacts, it becomes relatively autonomous from class dynamics, economic exploitation, and it reacts back upon class exploitation. So there is, so to say, an articulation between class exploitation and social oppressions based on different identities. But in the long run, ultimately, it is the class dynamics which plays the determining role. In the last instance, of course, not in every instance. In every instance, you cannot say that, look here, in this particular incident, it is the caste dynamics which is playing the dominant role and not the class exploitation. It is very much possible. But in the last instance, historically speaking, it is the class exploitation which plays the determining role. If we don't understand that, then for instance, if you look at the evolution of caste system in India, we won't be able to explain why there were temporal and spatial changes in the caste system. So if you look at the Vellala caste in the South India, when it became the ruling caste, Varn and class, because at that time there was a large amount of overlapping between the spectrum of class and caste, not overlapping between caste and class conceptually, but the social spectrum of class and social spectrum of caste, that hierarchy, that there was a large degree of overlapping between them. So when the Vellalas become the dominant caste in the ruling caste and the ruling class, the Brahmins justified their rule. They obviously, every ruling class needs legitimation of its rule. Now that legitimation in the bourgeois society happens through hegemony, what Gramsci has called hegemony. Hegemony means ruling by consent. That is a different matter altogether, that consent is manufactured by the ruling class in a bourgeois democracy, because as Marx said, bourgeoisie not only controls the material means of production, bourgeoisie also controls the mental means of production. And that is why the ideas of the ruling class are the ruling ideas of an epoch. Needless to say, it doesn't mean that working class cannot build counter hegemony, but that is a separate question. But yes, Vellalas in South India, the peasant kingdoms that came into existence, they also needed justification. And for that, they literally imported Brahmins from North India who came here, and they call that Vellalas are basically Shudravarn, but they made a distinction. They said there are two kinds of Shudras, Sat Shudras and Asat Shudras. And the Sat Shudras are equivalent to Kshatriyas, and the Kshatriyas are basically protectors of the Brahmins. And the same status was given to the Sat Shudras here. Now, Shudra, why it happened? Because when this was happening, the Shudras in North India, the mid-Gangetic plains where the caste system emerged and consolidated itself, the Shudra Varna had already become the principal peasant caste, and it was oppressed by the ruling combine of Brahmins and Kshatriyas, which constituted the ruling class of that period. Now they came here, the Brahmins, to legitimize the rule of rulers here, the Vellala caste, and they created a new theory. They created a new ritualistic justification, but they, you see how caste system changed, caste Varna system, and through ages also, caste Varna system changed. You can read Suvira Jaiswal work that I already cited, how Gopati was converted into Gahpati. There is a very interesting story which we can't go into detail, but how the occupations of caste changed. Shudras were servile dependent labor, and Vaishyas were actually dominant main principal peasant caste before the Mauryan period. In Mauryan period, a change happens. The Shudras are converted into the principal peasant caste. Vaishyas transfer. This started happening from Buddha's period already, but it assumed more concrete shapes in the period of Mauryan Empire. And Vaishyas became the dominant mercantile caste. So these changes happened. So it is not Manu Smriti which engendered caste system. It is not religious scriptures which engendered caste Varna system. It was the other way around. It was the actual real relations of domination and subordination implicit in the Varna caste system which engendered texts like Manusmriti. And since here also you can say when the class dynamics changed, the hierarchy, the old hierarchy of caste Varna system, it was disturbed. So there was a process of fission and fusion. There was a process of restructuring of the hierarchy of castes and Varnas. What was determining this change in caste system? The changing dynamics of production relations and class relations. So one has to understand this fourth point also, that in the articulation of class dynamics and different identities and social oppressions based on those different identities, in the last instance, it is the class dynamics which plays the determining role. Otherwise, we cannot give any kind of causation or any kind of rigorous causal analysis of the changes in racism or casteism or gender oppression or patriarchy. It would appear that all these identities were kind of divinely given, static, and they have remained as such forever. And any student of history, even with elementary knowledge of history of world and India, knows that it is not the case. All these systems of social oppressions have evolved, changed, restructured themselves, adopted by different modes of production, co-opted by different social systems, sublated by different political systems. And that is how one can trace the history of different forms of social oppression. The next important point, which is often emphasized as some kind of novel invention, that every individual is standing at the intersection of many identities. Now, intersectionality theorists, you know, present this fact as something which was discovered by them for the first time. So it is a false claim to novelty. We have known from time immemorial that every individual in any society stands at the intersection of many identities. So one can be a man, a Dalit, transgender or homosexual. So he's at the same time many things. And this comes naturally to human beings unless and until somebody tells us that no, one identity is overriding identity, or someone tells that we cannot represent many identities simultaneously. That is what happens with, whenever there is a right wing movement for Semitization of any identity. Hindu identity is also being Semitized in the same way, that you cannot be many things, there must be a unitary identity. But unless and until a political force or a movement tells you that you cannot stand at the intersection of many identities, it comes very much naturally to everyone. I mean, if you look at this is something which people don't even bother about. There is a little anecdote. In 1960, 54% Americans were unable to tell about their ethnic origin in the census of US. 54% of Americans did not know or were unable to articulate what ethnic origin they are coming from. Now look at the change which happened between 1960 and 1990. Between 1960 and 1990, people reporting themselves as Native Americans or American Indians increased from 0.5 million to 2 million. This is not simply a demographic increase. It can be understood in 30 years. That kind of demographic increase cannot happen. So it was the rise of identity politics, and it was the rise of identity based social oppressions which made people bother about it. Otherwise it came naturally to everyone. It was a given, it was axiomatic that any individual stands at the intersection of many identities. The next important thing about identities is that identities are not static, they shift, they change, they evolve, and they mutate. One representative example of this is the emergence of a new ethnic identity from among groups which were totally non-ethnic groups. That example pertains to the movement of Martin Luther King Jr. So any comrade familiar with the history of civil rights movement and the movement of Martin Luther King Jr. knows the emergence of a Southern Christian Baptist church, which became an ethnic identity. It's now an ethnic identity. But this ethnic identity was nowhere there in the history or society before the movement of Martin Luther King Jr. A similar example is given by Eric Hobsbawm. He has a brilliant article on his collection called On History. I think it is called Postmodernism in History or something like that. I don't remember the exact name of the paper. He talks about the case of a Protestant professor in Nazi Germany who suddenly came to know that he was a Jew. He never knew it, because by the new established standards of Christianness, he was no longer a Christian. Actually, whether he was a Jew or not doesn't matter. And this happened with thousands of Protestants in Germany, which was one of the land of origination of Protestant movement. So one can see that identities are not static, they evolve, they change, they mutate according to the changing historical, social, political context, according to the changing dynamics of political and social class struggle. The meanings of identities change, the expressions of identities change, the very definition of identities change. So this is very important to understand. It will become clear as we move along, because these things sometimes are not understood, and one starts by landing somewhere with a parachute in between the rigorous logic and is unable to follow what is happening later. And these are some very foundational issues which one must understand before we can delve into the question of identity politics and whether Marxism is sufficient to understand the question of identities or not. So, to summarize discussion up till now, one, identities are not always already or automatically the site of a site of social oppression. Every identity becomes a site of oppression. In other words, every form and ideology of social oppression has a history. It is not divinely ordained, always there from time immemorial. Every form or an ideology of social oppression came into existence at a particular time or moment of history, in history, and in the moment of class dynamics of the society. And that class dynamics might express itself as Martin Luther King's movement, or it can express or articulate itself as the rise of Nazi Germany and the resistance to Nazi movement, etc. It might take myriad forms, but this much is certain. Second is, identities are not fixed. They constantly evolve, change, mutate, and so do their expressions and their form. The third is that if we don't understand the historicity of identities and social oppressions based on identities, we won't be able to understand the contemporaneity of identity. That is, today, how we see identities and social oppressions based on identity. Only on the basis of understanding the historicity, that is, the evolution of different identities and social oppressions based on these identities across time, across different stages in history. Now we come to the second part of our discussion. What is identity politics? Identity politics, is a very different thing to define, because it is an ensemble of different kind of theories, different kind of ideas. But if one delves deeper, one can fairly accurately enumerate the defining characteristic features of identity politics. And this is very amusing, very funny. Before I move forward, I would like to narrate a little incident which happened a few days back in America. There was a demonstration of LGBTQ community, and during the demonstration itself, there was a split in demonstration. The black LGBTQ community split away from the general LGBTQ movement on the question that they face racial oppression from the white LGBTQ and those who pass as whites. This is also a very funny thing. It's a specific kind of privilege. It's called passing as white privilege. Those who are not actually Caucasian, but they can somehow pass as Caucasian white. So they split away from that, and they said that our experience of oppression, the black LGBTQ community, their activists said that our experience of oppression, you should keep quiet about it. Don't speak about it, because only I can speak about my oppression. So only women will speak about women's oppression. Only Jews will speak about anti-Semitism. Only blacks will speak about racism. Only Dalits will speak about Dalit oppression. This is a very funny incident, and the whole story of last 3-4 decades of identity politics is precisely this: endless fragmentation of the movements and organizations of oppressed people. So this brings us to the first important defining characteristic feature of identity politics. That is, only those who experience a particular form of social oppression based on identity can understand it and fight against it. And all others are actually part of the problem. They are beneficiaries, consciously, subconsciously, or unconsciously. That is the first argument of identity politics. So only women can understand the oppression of women, only women can fight against the oppression of women, and all others are part of the problem. They should keep quiet, they should better shut up and don't speak about women oppression, because they are objectively beneficiary of that particular form of oppression. That is the first characteristic feature. The second characteristic feature is that all forms of social oppressions based on different identities are independent of and autonomous from each other. They are totally separate systems. There is no causal link, for example, between caste oppression and patriarchy. There is no causal link between oppression of blacks and anti-Semitism in the US. So all these oppressions are completely independent of and autonomous from each other. And since all these forms of social oppression are completely independent of and autonomous from each other, they require completely independent and autonomous struggles. So no concerted struggle, no united struggle, no common enemy. So all oppressed communities will struggle separately, autonomously, and independently of each other. This is the second important thing. This we can call two systems approach. Two systems approach is that they say that class exploitation is one system, identity based oppression is another system, and some people are so benevolently and generously are ready to concede that okay, for class system you can have Marxism, you can have your Marxism and eat it too. And for social oppressions based on identity, you need other theories. From there comes the idea of mixing of lal and neela, blue and red. From there comes the idea of what I call aggregative equationism. For example, how to fight fascism and Narendra Modi in India today? You add up. So an additive, aggregative equation of women plus Dalits plus tribals plus OBC plus Muslims plus Sikhs. Now we have been waiting for this equation to realize for past 30 years. But it is not happening because it cannot happen. Why it cannot happen? Who are the principal oppressors of Dalits in the countryside today? If you go by the government data and non-government data, it is the upward mobile peasant middle caste, not the Thakurs and Brahmins. Even though the ideology that the middle upward dynamic middle caste is using to oppress Dalit is Brahminical ideology. But it is not a Brahmin person necessarily in person who is oppressing the Dalit. It is generally speaking, if you go, I'm pretty sure about North India and I'm pretty sure about certain parts of Southern India. I'm not sure about some other parts because, as Mao said, no investigation, no right to speak. But as far as I have come to, come across different regions of India, it is principally, for example, who are the oppressors of Dalits in Haryana? Economically well-to-do, upward mobile Jat peasants, farmers. Who are the principal oppressors of Dalits in Maharashtra? They are the upward mobile, economically well-off capitalist Maratha farmers. Right? So, if you look at that, that is why an equation of Dalit plus OBC is not going to work. It can't work. It is a stillborn child. It is not going to, toddle its way to glory. That much is clear and certain and evident. And even those people, those so-called Marxists, who were mixing this red and blue, a person actually asked me कि लाल और नीला को मिलाएंगे उसके बारे में आपका क्या मानना है? तो मैंने कहा उससे बैंगनी बनेगा और कुछ नहीं होगा. Nothing more. It will create violet color. It is not going to have any repercussion whatsoever in terms of social or political program of a movement or the strategy of resisting fascism in India today. So this is what two systems approach can lead to. Again, with the next important characteristic feature of identity politics is that social oppression becomes a subjective thing. It no longer remains a material, real, actual relation of domination and subordination, because it depends completely on the subjective experience of the individual. So it becomes completely self-referential, it becomes completely self-defined, and anything can be passed as social oppression. Those who have seen that movie, Life of Brian, Monty Python, there is a scene where it is a comment on disintegration of left movement. Two persons are sitting who are representing People's Liberation Front of that imaginary country. A split happens. One becomes Liberation Front of People for that country. One becomes People's Liberation Front of that country. And within that one organization, only two people remain. One person says, from now on, I want to call me patrician. That is a man. So the other person says, but you are a man. So he says that, don't argue with me, you are oppressing me. I want to be called by Patricia. Now we know that he has all the right to be called Patricia, and he has all the right to express his gender identity. But this is one example where even in 1970s, the Monty Python, completely anarchic group, which created a comedy which commented on everything. It appeared as if it is above ideology. So it ridiculed capitalism, it ridiculed communism, it ridiculed Marxist, it ridiculed everybody. But they had a position. That is an issue of film criticism. We can't go into that. But basic cheese is this. Identity politics makes social oppression an issue of personal experience of oppression as felt by the individual. Therefore, instead of being a material relation of subordination and domination, it becomes completely self-referential, self-defined, and subjective thing. This is another important tenet of identity politics. The next important tenet brings us to one of the sects within identity politics. It is called privilege theory. Privilege theory focuses not so much on the oppressed, it focuses on the oppressor. So it says that, see, those who define themselves as oppressed are oppressed, all others are basically privileged. What is privilege? Privilege is, the set of benefits that a person enjoys due to his belonging to the oppressing identity. So if you are a man, you, in the words of Peggy McIntosh, you are carrying a knapsack without weight. You have privileges as a man. You have privileges as a caste Hindu. You have privileges as within women. Savarn women will have privileges vis-a-vis Dalit women. Within Dalit women, physically handicapped Dalit women will have privileges vis-a-vis physically healthy Dalit women. Within the physically, so you can go on and on ad infinitum. So this is what privilege is. Now we know that it is true that as a person belonging to an identity of oppressing social section, people do get some benefits whether they want it or not. But this is only a description of the reality. It is not the analysis of how this social oppression came into existence. Was it there forever, from time immemorial? Was it there since the origin of species? No, it came into existence at some point of time. So for example, Peggy McIntosh, which I just quoted, identifies 46 areas where white male enjoys benefits in a Western society. All are basically expressions of racism in the social life. You can list it And you can prepare a list of not 4600 expressions. That doesn't make your analysis any more profound, because it is still a description, a recording of fact, or what you can call subjective positivism. What is positivism? Positivism is basically taking the appearance for essence. What appears is true. That is the essence of positivism. And subjective, because it is based on the subjective experience of the oppressed person. So Peggy McIntosh basically registers, records those expressions, but she has no analysis of how racism came into being and how one can fight it. So, and second thing that privileged theorists say, that if you are privileged as a man, then you cannot rise above your privilege and your prejudices. So the best you can do is what? You can sensitize yourself. That's all. You cannot be part of the struggle or lead the struggle for women liberation as a man. You cannot be an active organizer of women liberation movement because you are a man. Your job is to sit in the meeting of that women liberation organization, keep quiet, sensitize yourself. So identity replaces political life. Just because a woman says something doesn't make it correct. And in fact, the best carriers of patriarchy are not men, they are women. Every young woman sitting in the crowd knows this. The best carrier of patriarchal domination is not the father, it's the mother. Generally speaking. Obviously, there are exceptions. So, your identity doesn't automatically make you politically correct. This is replacing political line with identity, which leads to dangerous conclusions. Because as a pichada, Narendra Modi's each statement should be accepted as the divine truth. So this is what privileged theory leads to. Another subsect of identity politics is intersectionality theory, about which we talked. About this also, there was a joke going around when Hillary Clinton was fighting election against Trump. The joke goes like this. A guy from the US asks a guy from West Asia, says to a guy from West Asia that, look, we just had a black president. Now, most probably we are going to have a women president. Now, what do you call it? So the man from maybe Palestine or Syria says intersectional imperialism. That sums up the whole intersectional theory. Intersectionality, as I said, it basically claims novelty on something which was realized by, I don't know, from time immemorial, that every individual is standing at the intersection of identities. And this thought emerged in the black feminist movement. And then intersectionality theories were systematized by Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins. These were the two principal theorists of intersectionality theory. They say that when two types of social oppressions intersect, they don't give an additive impact, they create a third experience of oppression. For example, if there is a woman and also Dalit, her experience of social oppression as a woman and her experience of social oppression as a Dalit gives rise to a third kind of experience of social expression. But still, they claim that there can be no united movement of Dalits and women, because still these are different systems of social oppression. So even intersectionality theorists preclude at the outset, at the doorstep, any idea of united, concerted struggle against a common enemy. So you have to fight separate, autonomous, independent struggle in your own sphere. And since, it is totally your personal experience which determines your oppression, and you don't have any common enemy to fight against with a united struggle of all oppressed and all exploited, you gradually retreat to your personal sphere, the sphere of interpersonal relationships. So what are you supposed to do? You have to create safe spaces. You have to learn to speak in non-oppressive language. You have to use the politically correct language all the time. And believe me, I've stayed in the US for 15, 14 days, couple of times, this I couldn't learn the politically correct language. Because if you use the term black, there will be, criticism that you are using a politically incorrect term. If you use Afro-American, still you will be using a politically incorrect term. And this becomes so complicated after some time that a common worker or common working person can never know what the politically correct language is. Arun must be knowing that. He's residing in the citadel of academic reaction, so he knows it. So who becomes enemy? Those who are not using politically correct language and oppressing people by language. So all oppression is reduced to language. So you have to use politically correct language so that you don't oppress. You have to create safe spaces, self-training, and gender sensitization, race sensitization. State is totally absorbed. State and the ruling class are put out of the dock right away. So these are some, and last thing which pertains to this, because the question of state is totally avoided or maybe even prohibited in the domains of identity politics. It's a politics of depoliticization. It leads you to a retreat to the sphere of interpersonal relationships. It forces you to retreat from political domain, from any revolutionary political debate, discussion or discourse. So it's basically politics of depoliticization. And the last claim of identity politics theorists who are more benevolent and generous, they say, we accept the reality of class. Class is also an identity, and just another identity. And it is the social oppression based on class is expressed in what? Snobbery. Right? Snobbery and classism. So class is reduced to being just another identity, just like gender or race or caste, and there is no primacy to be given to any identity. And there can be no causal link between all identities and class, and there can be no united program for resistance and struggle. So these are some of the fundamental characteristic features of identity politics, and that is why in the last 30-40 years of identity politics, what we have seen is a constant and endless fragmentation of organizations of the oppressed people, of Dalits, of women, of tribals, endless fragmentation. That is the gift of identity politics to us. Those who claim that they understand identity and those who claim that Marxism is insufficient to understand identity. Now there is a philosophical foundation of identity politics, and this philosophical foundation was prepared by basically two streams of philosophical thought. One is Michel Foucault's Foucauldian postmodernism, and the second is post-Marxist thought of Laclau and Mao. We will discuss the basic features of these philosophical streams in very brief. Foucault, let us deal with Foucault first, because he's even today one of the most fashionable figures in the departments of history, in the departments of philosophy, political science, everywhere. And sadly, there is no systematic critique from Marxist-Leninist standpoint of Foucault right now. There are articles, but we are preparing a lengthy systematic critique of Foucauldian thought, and it will be out sometime by the mid-2023. What is the first idea of Foucault? The first idea of Foucault is his concept of power. According to Foucault, power is not held by any state or ruling class or any collective. So he says power is decentered in the social body. I'm just paraphrasing Foucault. So power is decentered in the social body. And how is power constituted? Power is constituted by discourses. Discourses, institutions, and local practices. From where these discourses and local practices and institutions originate, Foucault doesn't say anything about that. It's a given in Foucauldian theory. So power is decentered, number one. power is constituted by discourses, power is not held by any ruling class or state, and since power is decentered, the resistance also has to be decentered. Because there is no common enemy, a state, a ruling class, which oppresses and exploits all working people from all exploited and oppressed backgrounds. There is no single enemy. And power resides in the discourse constituted by interpersonal relationships, the actions of institutions, the local practices. So first power is dissipated, then resistance is dissipated. This is the first tenet of Foucault's idea of power. The second point is that Foucault says that power is not simply repressive, it is also productive. How it is productive? He says power produces the subject. But then Foucault comes into a contradiction with his own first point. If power produces the subject, then how come subject can resist the power? So Foucault answers, the subject can resist the power when power allows it. When power allows it, the subject resists, and that resistance allows the power knowledge structure to restructure itself, to sublate itself, to re-articulate itself. This is the root of Foucault's theory of governmentality. What is the crux of Foucault's theory of governmentality is that there will be no revolution, there will be resistance when allowed by the power knowledge structure, and that resistance will force the state or government to change and mend its ways slightly, partially, and this is how the governmentality of the state will be ensured. We cannot go into the detail of that, but the basic point that Foucault is making is basically the subject is produced by power, the subject resists power when allowed by power, and therefore it allows power to reinvent itself, restructure itself, if you will. Third point that Foucault raises is that there is no such thing as objective knowledge or science. He says that the whole idea of objective knowledge or science is part of the domination project of Western modernity and enlightenment. And that is why he supported the Iranian Islamic Revolution, because Iranian Islamic Revolution represented the outburst of Oriental innocence, untouched by and uncontaminated by Western modernity, uncontaminated by power. Even though that movement itself was a thoroughly right-wing religious fundamentalist movement, Foucault supports it. Khomeini. So he says that the idea of universal truth or universality or generality itself is oppressive. Any universal crushes the particulars. So he pits the universal against particular, whereas the general or universal is nothing but the abstraction of particulars. But he creates an image where the particulars are pitted against the universal and general, as if general has come from without, not from the generalization and abstraction of the particular. And then he comes to, from this philosophical point, just look how he arrives at the political conclusion. He says that therefore, any act of collective resistance is futile because any collective is formed on the basis of some idea of generalization. If we are going to organize, for example, here, comrades gathered here, if we decide right now to organize on some issue, become united on some issue, we'll have to decide what is our common minimum agreement. The very process of determining what is our common minimum agreement is a process of generalization of our dissent. Right? But Foucault would immediately object and he will say, no, don't do this. Then what are you supposed to do? Resist power in your individual personal life. From there comes the Judith Butler's theory of performativity. So how can you resist power? Reject any norm, any universal in your personal life and make your life, in the words of Albert Camus, an act of rebellion. That's the best you are allowed to do. So if heterosexuality is the norm, homosexuality is a rebellion, or bisexuality is a rebellion. Any norm which you can reject in your personal individual life, but you are not allowed to organize. Because the moment you form a collective, an organization, you are preparing the backgrounder for another power structure which is oppressive. That is the three basic coordinates of Foucault's theory, which became the philosophical foundation of identity politics. Now comes the second source, philosophical source of identity politics, which is Laclau and Mouffe's theory of post-Marxism. They came up with a book called Hegemony and Social Strategy in 1985 or 86, I don't remember the exact year. In that book, they basically replicated Foucault to a large extent. So they said that the collapse of socialism in the USSR and the collapse of socialism in China has something to do with the rotten core of Marxism. Because the idea of Marxism is based on a totalizing emphasis on class, whereas society is constituted not by productions of relations of production and reproduction. Society is not a sum total of relations of production and reproduction. It is basically constituted by what they call an ensemble of partial discourses. He is basically reproducing Foucault in a new terminology. He is saying there is a partial discourse of racial segregation, there is a partial discourse of caste oppression, there is a partial discourse of oppression of homosexuals or the so-called sexually deviant people. And all these discourses, the partial discourses, are totally separate from each other. They have no link whatsoever. So society, what is society? Society is not a whole. Society is not a totality. It is basically not a totality of economic, social and political relationships. It is basically a crisscross of different unrelated, autonomous, independent antagonisms constituted by partial discourses. अब इतनी हवाबाजी का बेसिक आइडिया क्या है? ये सब इतने भारी भरकम शब्द, and we are coming from middle class intelligentsia, so we are outright blown away by the ornamentalism of the terminology. But this boils down to a simple thing, that oppressed peoples and exploited peoples and classes can have no common agenda. They can have no common enemy. They cannot and should not organize. So this is one. Then they replicate the idea that power is decentered, it is distributed through the society, and state therefore is not an institution of power responsible for exploitation of the working people and oppression of different socially oppressed communities, because the state itself is what? An autonomous independent discourse. It doesn't represent anything. It doesn't represent a class. It doesn't represent any particular social community wielding power. State itself is an independent autonomous discourse, and therefore, and don't be surprised, they say you can even ally with the state. So you ally with the state for what? He says recognition and accommodation. So Dalits can ally with state for recognition and accommodation against the Brahminical, fascist or the ruling class. So they should ally with the state, not realizing even for a single moment that the state itself has a gender, the state itself has a class character, the state itself in India has a caste and varna character. Which doesn't mean that it is the rule of caste Hindus. It simply means that the rule of the bourgeoisie represented by the Indian state is the principal privilege receiver and beneficiary of all forms of social oppression. That is why the state has a gender, it has a sex, and it has a caste and varna, because it uses it. Principally, foundationally, state is an instrument of class domination. And it is not something novel in India. In every country, you read Howard Zinn, People's History of USA, where Howard Zinn says that how racism percolated into the pores of US society. He talks about a period of early history of the USA where the working class was a motley crew, mixed. There is a very good book called Many-Headed Hydra, written by Peter Linebaugh and Marcus Rediker, which traces the history of development of capitalism across Atlantic in the northwestern Europe and America. And it says that the first working class which came into existence in the form of sailors and workers in different workshops and putting out system, this working class was racially, ethnically, linguistically, nationally very diverse. And the term many-headed hydra was used for this working class because the US bourgeoisie immediately recognized that the mixture of black, Latinos and different linguistic national communities among workers, if they mix up at the workplace, it creates a very militant kind of working class. Because soon the boundaries of language, nation, ethnicity, etc., they fall down. So what they did, 𝐓𝐚𝐫𝐱𝐢𝐬𝐃𝐢𝐬𝐦 talks about it. 𝐓𝐚𝐫𝐱𝐢𝐬𝐃𝐢𝐬𝐬 says that the working class still consisted of blacks and whites, but they constituted a police to police that working class, which was totally white. A white police to police the white workers as well as the black workers, and the whites were made to feel a sense of belonging to the white police, not to the black worker. It's a very interesting episode of American history. So that is how it functions. So that is one thing. Another point which 𝐚𝐫 and 𝐷𝐴𝐚𝐺 brought to fore was that the working class is not the revolutionary subject or revolutionary agent, because the class itself is just another identity, and since there are multiple centers of power and multiple centers of resistance, and therefore there are multiple subject positions. So there is no one revolutionary subject position, there are multiple subject positions to fight against multiple centers of power through multiple centers of resistance and struggle. All of this is obviously related to each other. Then they come to their conclusion. They say, and this is the most interesting and amusing point, they say that oppression becomes oppression only when it is consciously articulated by the oppressed as oppression. So, for example, till the slaves did not develop a political consciousness that they are oppressed by slave owners, there was no slave oppression. Till Dalits did not develop or articulate their oppression theoretically, till then there was no Dalit oppression. Again, you can see that oppression itself becomes a discourse. It is reduced to language. It is reduced to personal, subjective, self-referential experience. So unless and until you theorize your oppression as oppression, oppression is not oppression. So one can wonder that if hunger also is discourse, then maybe 𝐚𝐽 and 𝐷𝐴𝐚𝐺 should be closed in a room and should not be given food and water for a couple of weeks till they articulate their hunger as hunger. Till that time, their hunger should not be called hunger. That is the logical corollary of their argumentation, their line of argumentation. So this is the basic, you can see the coordinates of identity politics and the philosophical foundation of identity politics. Marxism, on the other hand, clearly responds without being apologetic that yes, our project of human emancipation is a universalist one. It doesn't mean that we don't recognize social oppression. It doesn't mean that we don't recognize the identities which become the site of social oppression. And that is the reason why world over, every part of the world, every country, Marxist-Leninists are in the forefront of all struggles against social oppression. It is not the identity politics NGOs or organizations based on identity politics which are at the forefront of the most militant and most radical struggle against social oppressions based on different identities. Even in late 19th century, in countries where working class population was a minuscule minority, the social democratic parties, which were called social democratic parties at that time, actually communist parties, they used to get, 𝐓𝐴 has written about it, they used to get 37% to 48% votes in their tactical participation in the parliament, even though working class in their country was not even 10 or 12%. Who were they getting votes from? Because all oppressed communities, all oppressed sections of societies, they were being led in their resistance and struggle against social oppression by Marxists. So it is not as if Marxism ever, ignored or neglected the question of identities or neglected the question of social oppression based on identities. It is just that Marxism tried to probe the history of social oppression in order to understand it, because any social or political or economic phenomenon can only be understood historically. Those who don't approach any question historically, they will not be able to understand in its contemporaneity also. So what Marxism does is not negate or deny social oppression or the question of identity. It tries to understand it in a scientific and historical fashion. How each form of social oppression and the question of identity emerged in history, evolved in history, and how each form and ideology of social oppression originated in the moment of class, not only originated, evolved, overlapped, and intersected in the moment of class, and how each form and ideology of social oppression was co-opted, adopted, adapted, molded and remolded, sublated, restructured and readjusted with every new mode of production, from the time of slavery up till the time of capitalism. That is what Marxism probes, without denying the reality of social oppression. It tries to understand it historically and scientifically, notwithstanding the fact that many Marxists are indeed class reductionist and economic determinist. That is true. And it has exacted a heavy price, in the sense of rise of these identity-based movements and decline of Marxist movement. What is the reason for that? The reason for that is that many Marxists, they started to emphasize on the economic immediate interests of the working class at the cost of general long-term political interest of the working class. Many Marxists forgot that working class is the revolutionary subject, not because we give primacy to the sectional economistic interests of the working class. Marx was very clear about it. Marx said that working class is the revolutionary subject due to two reasons. One, working class stands in a very unique relation vis-a-vis capitalism. Capitalism as a socio-economic and political system depends on the extraction and appropriation of the surplus labor of the working class. In the foundation of the entire capitalist politics, ideology and political economy lies the accumulated surplus labor of the working class. Without that, capitalism will collapse. This has led some people to subtraction theory within Marxism, which is nonsense, because it says that we workers will withdraw from work and capitalism will collapse. Withdraw from work and go where? On Mars? Obviously not. You can't withdraw from work, you have to struggle there. So, leaving apart the subtraction theory, this much is true, that capitalism as a socio-economic and political system, it is founded on the accumulation of the surplus labor extracted and appropriated by the capitalist class. Number one. And that is why working class is revolutionary subject, not because working class gives primacy or should give primacy to its sectional economic interest. And second reason that Marx also understood while discussing the case of Irish workers. And he says that the principal reason of impotence of English working class movement is its indifference to the Irish question. If the working class doesn't stand against all forms of oppression in all parts of the world, irrespective of the fact whether that oppression is affecting not the working class, some other class. Still then, it is the duty of the working class to resist and oppose and take a firm political position on all forms and ideologies of social oppression, and without that, Lenin says, without that, working class cannot become the leader of the working masses. It is not the proletariat which makes history. Nowhere Marx has written that. Marx has written that masses make the history. The other side of this dialectics is that masses don't spontaneously make history. They can make history only under the revolutionary leadership of the most advanced and revolutionary class, that is proletariat. And proletariat can become the leader of the masses only under the leadership of the proletarian party, which is nothing but the embodiment of proletarian science and detachment of the advanced detachment of the proletariat. So neither can you say that masses make history unconditionally, spontaneously, without any political leadership. Those who don't understand this don't understand why Arab Spring failed, why OWS failed, Occupy Wall Street failed, why the revolutionary situation just recently passed in Sri Lanka. You need to understand that spontaneous and organized apparatus of violence state can only be broken by the organized apparatus of revolutionary violence. Without that, spontaneous movements can lead to regime change, not systemic change. Regime change, just like Hosni Mubarak was thrown, or Ben Abidin Ali in Tunisia was overthrown. But it didn't lead to any systemic change. Mubarak was replaced by Muslim Brotherhood and then Morsi. No better than Mubarak in any way. So systemic change requires that. Two things: ideology, organization. Without ideology and without organization, a spontaneous mass movement, howsoever militant they are, howsoever radical they are, they cannot change the system. So Marxist project in that sense is, yes, it is universalist, but it doesn't negate or deny different forms of social oppression. It understands social oppression historically and scientifically, and it understands that without the leadership of proletariat, masses cannot overthrow the present system which constantly breeds, sustains, produces and reproduces not only economic exploitation of class, but all forms of social oppression. The common enemy must be recognized. Without recognition of the common enemy, there is no way forward. So I'll stop here. I'll thank you, all of you. You gave me so much time to make this presentation, and we can have the question and answer.